that it could happen in America. That it could happen now. That it could ever happen to me. Another murder tonight. At Watergate. My apartment.
Fellow Americans, you may be asking at this point in time, what's the White House hiding now? And we would be remiss were we to lend credence to the rumor that some fiend is skulking behind White House doors. No, fellow Americans, there's no truth at all about the Werewolf of Washington.
Simeon Oldman, writer, raconteur. We seek a lift or directions to the Crimson Manor film set.
Before you go, take this.
Right.
Right, everyone, let's all take 5. I think we're all feeling a bit frazzled, and it's been a very long shoot.
He's a piece of work, isn't he?
Something out there did something like this. There's a wolf. I heard, where's a wolf?
It happens in the woods at night. That is almost always where it happens. A man who was ordinary this morning, who had coffee and drove to work and said goodbye to someone he loved, is now on all fours in the dark between the trees, and something that was underneath the ordinary the entire time has finally come to the surface. And the most frightening thing about it is not the transformation. The most frightening thing is that somewhere inside what it has become, the man is still there, watching. You did not need the title. You already knew what kind of story this was. The werewolf has always been the horror genre's most personal monster. The vampire comes from outside. The ghost is something that happened to someone else. But the werewolf is already inside you, already present in the body you inhabit, already waiting for the right combination of moon and darkness. And whatever it is the decade you live in has done to the part of you that the ordinary life keeps carefully covered. The 1970s understood this with a specific and uncomfortable clarity. These were films made in a decade that had spent 10 years watching the people it trusted reveal what they were capable of when the circumstances were right, and that understood lycanthropy not as a supernatural curse, but as a metaphor for the thing that is already present in every person and that the social order exists primarily to suppress. You caught these late at night on television when the house was quiet and the only light was the screen, or you found them in the horror section of the video rental store with cover art that showed you something running through the trees and made you understand before you pushed play that the thing running was not entirely the thing you needed to be afraid of. Tonight we are going into 7 of those films. 7 werewolf horror pictures from the 1970s that understood the monster, not as a creature from outside the natural order, but as something the natural order had been containing all along, and that asked what happened when that containment failed in specific and personal and sometimes political ways. One of these films interrupts itself halfway through to ask the audience to guess which character is the werewolf, a device so perfectly suited to the film's actual premise that the film has spent 50 years being remembered for it, when it deserved to be remembered for considerably more. And one of these films is a British horror picture built on a story about a man raised by wolves in 19th century France, and the city that could not contain what the wilderness had made of him. Somewhere in this list is a scene that is going to put you right back in that room, at that age, in the dark, with the specific and completely personal understanding that the monster the film is describing is not something that lives in the woods.
Who killed her? He was wild dogs, boy. This couldn't be done by a human person. Take your hands off me, mister! You hold on to your manners, boy!
The mark was along here. That's where a left-handed person would strike you, if you were facing him. You've got a murder, Sheriff.
You saying it wasn't wild dog?
There's more than one kind.
What did you find when you examined Ellie?
Just that she was murdered. Dogs didn't do it.
Like I said.
Sheriff, I have an interesting aversion to my maladies being paraded around the town.
He's saying loup-garou. Werewolf. He's saying werewolf. He says that I'm its next victim.
Something is killing people in the Louisiana bayou, and the sheriff is trying very hard to make it fit into the category of things that sheriffs know how to deal with. It does not fit. Moon of the Wolf arrived in 1972 as an ABC television movie directed by Daniel Petrie, and it is the werewolf picture that the early 1970s produced at its most atmospherically grounded and most regionally specific. David Jansen plays Sheriff Aaron Whitaker, a Louisiana lawman investigating a series of brutal deaths in the bayou outside a small town, and who encounters the organized resistance of a community that knows more than it is saying. Petrie shoots the Louisiana locations with a documentary eye that gives the film a texture that studio-bound horror pictures of the same period could not achieve. The specific quality of bayou heat and Spanish moss, and the particular silence of a landscape that contains things the people living on its edge have learned not to investigate after dark. The film placed its werewolf inside a close-knit southern community where the social arrangements depended on certain things remaining unspoken, and the specific horror of that arrangement is that the monster and the silence that protects it are products of the same system. The moment that defines the film is Jansen's sheriff arriving at a farmhouse at night, and the quality of the silence he finds there. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something that has just stopped, and the understanding that arrives before he opens the door about what he is going to find on the other side of it. Moon of the Wolf was seen by a large television audience on its original broadcast, and then found its second life through home video and late-night cable, which is the circuit that the best television horror of the decade traveled to reach the viewers who were going to carry it. What it leaves behind is the question that every werewolf story operating inside a specific community eventually asks: if the monster is already a member of the community and the community already knows it, what exactly is being protected when everyone agrees not to say so? Moon of the Wolf built its horror inside a community's organized silence about what was living among them. The film that follows it takes the same dynamic and moves it from the Louisiana bayou into the California mountains, where a father and son discover that the wilderness contains something that the boy is going to spend the rest of the film trying to convince everyone around him is real.
A mother couldn't believe it.
Rich, stop this monster nonsense.
A father couldn't believe it.
Stop it, son. Killing isn't funny.
A sheriff couldn't believe it.
Devils, witches, werewolves have been with us throughout the ages. Children do actually see monsters.
A figment of a boy's imagination, or true.
Found it this morning. One of the victim's head was missing.
God, that's awful.
Give us this demon and let us exorcise it.
The boy saw what happened. He was there. He watched his father get bitten in the woods under a full moon, and he watched what the bite did, and he has been telling anyone who will listen exactly what he saw, and the problem is not that no one believes him. The problem is that his father does not want anyone to believe him. The Boy Who Cried Werewolf arrived in 1973, directed by Nathan H. Juran for Universal Pictures, and it is the werewolf picture that the decade produced at its most directly attentive to the specific horror of a child whose accurate perception of reality is systematically denied by the adults who are supposed to protect him. Kerwin Matthews plays Robert Bridgestone, a divorced father who takes his son Richie to the family's remote mountain cabin and is attacked by a werewolf during a nighttime hike, and what follows is not primarily a story about the transformation, but a story about the sustained effort to prevent the truth of the transformation from being acknowledged. Scott Seeley plays Richie with the completely grounded quality of a child who knows what he saw and who understands before the adults around him do that. Knowing what you saw and being believed about it are two entirely different problems. Juran shoots the California mountain locations with a practical eye that makes the wilderness feel genuinely dangerous, and the film's horror operates almost entirely in the gap between what Richie knows and what the adult world is willing to accept. The moment that defines the film is Richie in a police station, and the quality of the sheriff's response to his account, which is not cruelty and not dismissiveness, but the particular professional patience of a man who has decided in advance what kind of story he is listening to, and who has organized everything Richie says into that category before it is finished being said. The Boy Who Cried Werewolf was overlooked on release and has remained in the margins of the werewolf film conversation. The fate of pictures doing something more interesting than their genre classification suggests. What it leaves behind is the question that its title makes impossible to ignore. If the child is telling the truth about the monster, and the monster is the child's own father, at what point does being believed become more important than being believed by the right person? The Boy Who Cried Werewolf placed its horror inside the failure of adult authority to take a child's accurate perception seriously. The film that follows it moves the werewolf from the California mountains into the corridors of political power in Washington, D.C., and discovers in that relocation a satire so specific to its moment that the film has been waiting ever since for its decade to be fully understood.
That it could happen in America. That it could happen now. That it could ever happen to me. Another murder tonight. At Watergate. My apartment.
Fellow Americans, you may be asking at this point in time, what's the White House hiding now? And we would be remiss were we to lend credence to the rumor that some fiend is skulking behind White House doors. No, fellow Americans, there's no truth at all about the Werewolf of Washington.
The press secretary to the President of the United States has been bitten by a werewolf in Hungary and has returned to Washington, and the film is entirely serious about this and is also, simultaneously and without contradiction, one of the most pointed political satires the 1970s produced. Werewolf of Washington arrived in 1973, directed by Milton Moses Ginsburg, and it arrived at the exact cultural moment when its central metaphor was most legible. The year of Watergate, when the gap between the public presentation of American political power and the reality of what that power was actually doing became impossible to ignore. Dean Stockwell plays Jack Whittier, a White House press secretary who brings a werewolf curse back from a diplomatic posting in Hungary and who spends the film attempting to manage the consequences of that curse within the specific and absurd framework of Washington political life. Ginsburg maintains, throughout the complete deadpan of a film treating its premise with total seriousness, while ensuring that every scene lands in the register of a joke whose punchline the audience supplies themselves. The early 1970s were the moment when political satire and horror discovered they were describing the same territory, and this film made that discovery most directly, placing its monster inside the White House and then declining to comment on whether the placement constituted a significant change to the existing situation. The moment that defines the film is Stockwell at a White House function surrounded by the full ceremonial apparatus of political power, maintaining the performance of normalcy while the transformation builds underneath it, which is a description of a werewolf story and also a description of every political scandal the decade produced. Werewolf of Washington was dismissed on release as a minor satire that could not decide what it was and has been slowly reassessed by audiences who found in its tonal ambiguity a precise and fully controlled artistic choice rather than a failure of direction. What it leaves behind is the question the film's central image keeps asking. If the monster is already inside the house, and the people in the house already know it, and the house is the White House, does the werewolf story have a resolution, or does it just have a press conference? Werewolf of Washington moved its monster into the corridors of political power and discovered the relocation changed very little. The film that follows it moves the werewolf back into the wilderness, into a remote Montana setting, and a hunt organized by a man who believes the most dangerous thing in any landscape is the thing that has no natural predator.
Simeon Oldman, writer, raconteur. We seek a lift or directions to the Crimson Manor film set.
Before you go, take this.
Right.
Right, everyone, let's all take 5. I think we're all feeling a bit frazzled, and it's been a very long shoot.
He's a piece of work, isn't he?
Something out there did something like this. There's a wolf. I heard, where's a wolf?
He has hunted everything, every animal on every continent, every challenge the wilderness has offered, and he has found all of it insufficient. Now his former protege has told him there is something in the Montana wilderness killing people in a way that no known animal accounts for, and for the first time in years he is interested. Scream of the Wolf arrived in 1974 as an ABC television movie directed by Dan Curtis, who had built his horror reputation through Dark Shadows, and who brought to the werewolf story the gothic atmosphere and sustained dread that defined his best work. Peter Graves plays Byron Willis, a celebrated big game hunter drawn into an investigation of brutal killings by his former protege John Weatherby, played by Clint Walker, a man who has withdrawn from the world and built a life of deliberate isolation in the Montana wilderness. Curtis shoots the film with the atmospheric quality that defined his television horror work, building dread through tone rather than production value, and the dynamic between Graves and Walker gives the film a specific and sustained tension that conventional monster horror would not have produced. The early 1970s were processing deep anxiety about masculinity and its performance, the specific unease of a decade in which traditional markers of male authority were being examined and found insufficient, and Scream of the Wolf placed that anxiety inside a story about two men and a wilderness, and the question of which of them understood the animal world better, and what that understanding cost. The moment that defines the film is a conversation between Graves and Walker, in which the full shape of what Walker has built his wilderness life around begins to become visible, and the quality of Graves's response, which is not alarm, but the focused attention of someone who has just understood something that changes the entire context of everything that came before it. Scream of the Wolf found its second audience through late-night cable repeat broadcasts and eventually home video, the circuit that the best television horror of the decade consistently traveled. What it leaves behind is the question the film builds toward with patience. If the hunt is the only thing that makes a man feel alive, and the conventional hunt has been exhausted, what is the next quarry, and who decided the rules about what is permitted to be hunted? Scream of the Wolf placed its horror inside a hunter's relationship with the wilderness, and the specific thing he had decided to find there. The film that follows it moves from Montana into the contained horror of a remote Hawaiian island, where a businessman discovers that no amount of distance from his ordinary life can outrun the thing that has been waiting inside it. He goes to Hawaii for a vacation and comes back with something that no amount of tropical sun and ocean air was able to prevent. And the film is honest from its opening frames about the fact that what he brought back from Hawaii is considerably less restful than what he went there to find. Death Moon arrived in 1978 as a CBS television movie directed by Bruce Kessler, and it is the entry in the decade's werewolf cycle that understood most clearly what the television movie format could do with lycanthropy that theatrical films were not positioned to attempt. Place the transformation inside the specific and completely ordinary context of a man's midlife crisis, and ask whether escape makes things better or simply relocates the thing being escaped to a more scenic backdrop. Robert Foxworth plays Jason Palmer, a Boston businessman whose physical and psychological collapse sends him to Hawaii on doctor's orders, and the film follows his slow discovery that the island contains something connected to his family's history that no amount of distance from Boston was ever going to help him outrun. Kessler shoots the Hawaiian locations with an eye for the specific eeriness of a landscape that presents itself as paradise and that contains underneath that presentation its own history and its own relationship with the moon and the night that the tourists moving across its surface were not asked about. The moment that defines the film is Foxworth on the beach at night, the ocean behind him, the full moon above him, and the quality of the silence preceding the transformation, which the film holds longer than is comfortable, and which contains the particular suspended dread of a man who knows something is about to happen, and who has run out of continent to put between himself and what was always going to happen. Death Moon found its audience through late-night cable broadcasts and home video, and has been carried since by horror audiences who discovered in its midlife crisis framework something the more conventional werewolf pictures were not providing. What it leaves behind is the question the midlife crisis narrative and the werewolf narrative share more completely than any other combination. If you go far enough from the life you built to find out who you are underneath it, and what you find is something your life had been successfully suppressing, was the suppression the problem or the solution? Death Moon found its horror in the thing a man carries inside him that no vacation can reach and no distance can outrun. The two films that close this list move from the individual to the communal and the historical, both understanding that the werewolf story was most frightening when most specific about the human being the monster had been before the moon rose.
One of you is a werewolf!
You must track down the werewolf. One of these 8 people is a werewolf. Can you guess which one?
Which one? Which one? Which one? Which one? Which one? Which one? Which one? Which one?
One of these 8 people will turn into a werewolf. Can you guess who it is when we stop the film for the werewolf break? See it, solve it, but don't tell. The beast must die.
8 people, a country estate, a millionaire who has announced to his guests that he believes one of them is a werewolf. The film is going to stop itself at the climax and give you 30 seconds to guess which one. This is not a gimmick. This is the most honest thing the film could have done with its premise. The Beast Must Die arrived in 1974, directed by Paul Annette for Amicus Productions, and it is the most formally inventive entry in the decade's werewolf cycle, a picture that took the Agatha Christie country house mystery structure and the werewolf premise and combined them with a self-awareness and wit that the more solemn entries in the genre were not attempting. Calvin Lockhart plays Tom Newcliffe, a millionaire big game hunter who has gathered a group of suspects including Peter Cushing as a zoologist, Charles Gray as a diplomat, and Anton Diffring as a composer at his heavily surveilled estate for the specific purpose of identifying and hunting the monster he believes is among them. Annette directs with control and confidence, and the film uses its mystery structure with genuine intelligence, understanding that the pleasure of the country house mystery and the dread of the werewolf story are not incompatible, but are versions of the same pleasure and the same dread. The suspense of not knowing which face conceals the thing that is going to destroy you. The moment that defines the film is the werewolf break, the 30-second pause the narrator instructs the audience to use to make their guess, and the quality of that pause, which is a genuinely unsettling invitation to sit alone in the dark and decide who among the people on screen is the monster, which is the question every werewolf story has always been asking, and that this film has the honesty to ask directly. The Beast Must Die was a modest success for Amicus, and has maintained a devoted following among horror audiences who found in its combination of mystery structure and werewolf horror something neither genre was producing alone at the same level of craft. What it leaves behind is the answer to the question the werewolf break poses. The monster is the person you did not suspect, and the reason you did not suspect them is the same reason you would not suspect yourself. The Beast Must Die asked its audience to identify the monster among a group of people, and discovered that the identification always said something about the person doing the identifying. The film that closes this list takes everything the decade understood about the werewolf as the human beneath the human and builds it into the most atmospherically accomplished and emotionally serious werewolf horror picture the early 1970s produced.
Howling, obscene terror is brought to you in Legend of the Werewolf. How is a child protected by wolves and brought up in the forests? What makes him become that most ungodly of creatures, a werewolf? Myth? Not myth to the people of Europe who experience this evil. Not myth to the citizens of Paris who are to suffer the same terror. A werewolf. Nothing is sacred from this savage power and hatred, whose only thought is to destroy and kill. Men, women, children, no one is safe when the werewolf prowls. From a European forest to a Paris suburb, from a boarding house to the depths of a great city, the evil of a werewolf reigns in this Tyburn tale of terror.
He was raised by wolves, not metaphorically, literally. His mother died in the snow at his birth, and the wolves that found him raised him as one of their own. And when the circus people took him from the forest and gave him a name and a place in the show, they took the boy, but they could not take what the wolves had made of him. And Paris is going to find that out. Legend of the Werewolf arrived in 1975, directed by Freddie Francis for Tyburn Productions, the small British studio attempting to continue the gothic horror tradition that Hammer was winding down, and it is the film that the decade's werewolf cycle produced at its most emotionally serious and most visually accomplished. David Rintoul plays Etoile, the wolf boy grown into a young man working at a Paris zoo in the 19th century, living an ordinary life with an extraordinary history that the city around him has no way of accounting for, and falling in love with a woman named Christine, whose situation mirrors his own in ways the film handles with genuine emotional delicacy. Peter Cushing plays Professor Paul Cataflanc, the police surgeon investigating the killings that follow Etoile through the Paris streets, a man of science whose investigation leads him toward a conclusion his science does not have the vocabulary to express, and that his humanity is not going to let him ignore. Francis shoots the film with the cinematographic control he brought to everything, understanding light and shadow with a precision that no modest budget could undermine, and the period production design gives the film an atmospheric density that the productions it resembles at its surface were not consistently achieving in the same year. The moment that defines the film is Etoile in the zoo at night, alone with the animals that are the closest thing to his actual family the world has provided, and the quality of his relationship with them, which is not the relationship of a keeper with his charges, but the relationship of a creature with its own kind, and the camera holding on his face long enough for you to understand that what the wolves raised is not a monster, but a person who has been asked to live in a world built entirely for a different kind of animal. Legend of the Werewolf closed the British Gothic werewolf tradition with a film that honored everything that tradition had built and added to it a specific emotional intelligence and compassion for its monster that the tradition had not always managed. Tyburn produced only 2 more films after this one before closing, which means Legend of the Werewolf represents both the peak of what that studio achieved and the end of it. What it leaves behind is not a question but an image. Etoile on the streets of Paris at night, caught between the wilderness that made him and the city that cannot contain him, belonging entirely to neither, and carrying both inside him simultaneously, the werewolf story at its most honest and its most human. 7 films. 7 different ways that the 1970s looked at the monster in the mirror and understood that the mirror was showing them something that was already there before the moonrise. None of these pictures were really about what they appeared to be about on the surface. Moon of the Wolf was not about a werewolf in the Louisiana bayou. The Boy Who Cried Werewolf was not about a child whose father was bitten in the California mountains. Werewolf of Washington was not about a press secretary who brought a curse back from Hungary. Scream of the Wolf was not about a hunt in the Montana wilderness. Death Moon was not about a businessman who went to Hawaii and found something waiting for him there. The Beast Must Die was not about 8 people in a country estate and 30 seconds to guess which one was the monster. And Legend of the Werewolf was not about a man raised by wolves in 19th century France who could not survive what the city made of him. They were all about the same thing, the thing that the werewolf story has always been about when it is working at its full capacity, that the most frightening transformation is not the one the moon causes, but the one the ordinary life has been suppressing, and that the suppression is a temporary arrangement, and that the arrangement fails in ways that the person it fails is always the last to understand and the first to suffer the consequences of. These were films made by people who understood that the 1970s was a decade in which the suppressions of the previous generation were failing publicly, and in real time, in which the things that institutions and individuals had been keeping carefully covered were coming to the surface in forms that nobody was prepared for, and that the werewolf story was the genre's most precise instrument for describing that process. They made television movies and country house mysteries and political satires and gothic horror pictures because those formats gave them access to audiences that were ready for that description, whether they knew it or not. So here is what I need from you. Which transformation stayed? Not the most spectacular and not the most technically accomplished. The one that landed somewhere personal. The one that made you think about something you had been keeping carefully covered. Drop it in the comments and tell me where you first saw it and what it was about the film that got past the defenses that the ordinary life provides. If this list found something you had been carrying without knowing it, hit like. It takes 1 second, and it tells me that this kind of content is worth continuing. Subscribe if you want to be here for what comes next, because the next video is going somewhere this one only pointed toward. The Italian giallo horror films of the 1970s that built their terror not from monsters or curses, but from the specific and completely human darkness of an ordinary person deciding to do something that cannot be undone, and the camera that follows them into that decision with a patience and a visual intelligence that the genre had never previously achieved and has never fully recovered since. Those films are coming, and some of them are going to get somewhere inside you that the werewolf story was too honest to reach.
Subscribe for the next nightmare.